Welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal priest. I live here in Austin, Texas, and I've had the gift of recovery since December the 27th of 1972. Very grateful for that. And I'm interested in the kind of the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, the psychology and the spirituality that underlie the program. And that's really what these podcasts are about. It's an attempt to go a little bit deeper into the recovery world, let's say, and we approach it in a number of different ways. If you haven't done so, I would really encourage you to go to the website that we have. It's called Two-Way Prayer, TWO, and we have a new video that's up there. It explains the history of the 11th step as they used to do it in the very early days of the program, where they were listening to God, listening and writing the thoughts that came into their minds. And I think you'll find it interesting and helpful if you're interested in that kind of thing. I want to also just thank our donors. We couldn't do this thing without help from a lot of people. So donations are really appreciated. It just helps us carry the message out to more and more people. We're starting a new series right now, and it is titled The Power of Now. And if that title sounds somewhat familiar, it's probably because you've heard of the book by Eckhart Tolle. And it's that title, The Power of Now, sold more than 2 million copies, and it's helped a great many addicts and non-addicts find their way to what the big book calls the great reality within. And leading us on this new adventure is my friend Dr. Bruce from Los Angeles, California. Dr. Bruce did his graduate work in clinical psychology at Duquesne University. He's a psychotherapist, couples counselor, and mindfulness skills teacher. He's in private practice in Southern California. Specializes in and enjoys working with couples and individuals in 12-step recovery, leads relationship workshops and meditation retreats throughout the year. Dr. Bruce teaches frequently at Department of Religion and Spirituality at Loyola Marymount University, classes on spiritual writers such as Eckhart Tolle, Thich Nhat Hanh, Ken Wilber, David Hawkins, to name but a few. So, Bruce, welcome. It's really good to have you here with us, and I'm looking forward to this new series. And
thank you, Father Bill.
Perhaps you could begin by telling us a little bit of your own background, your recovery story, and early life education, that kind of thing. And what was it that attracted you to Eckhart Tolle?
Thank you for asking. So my story, Eckhart would be very cautious about telling stories because a lot of them are just in part kind of a fictional narrative. But the sense I make from analyzing my upbringing was that I grew up in a dysfunctional environment. My father was very angry and abusive. There was a lot of drama and tension and fighting in the household. And my parents, God love them, they got married when they were 17. They had me when I was 19. So they did the best they could. But the sense of threat at home had a profound effect on me because I never felt safe. And that was kind of my main inheritance from that early childhood experience. And so that created a lot of an unhealthy self relationship. And so at a very young age, I found ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Family. And that was a real turning point for me, because to be in those rooms, and ACA back then was very popular and thriving community. And it was really reassuring for me to hear how universal the story was. I had a sense that this was, just my personal weirdness, and to hear other people
Well, and
You
it's
know,
the
other
stuff
people.
that people don't talk about. We cover it up.
Yeah.
We're taught the family
Yeah. So that
secrets.
was
You don't talk about that stuff in public.
yeah. So I remember vividly in the first room, I went, wow, people are actually talking about this stuff and it's my story. And it was such a relief. That alone was probably the biggest blessing of going into those rooms,
Right.
feeling uh, that I was connected with everyone else. Did a lot of work in ACA. That was my primary and basically my recovery work. And it always was quizzical to me that not a lot of people would be in 12-step fellowships in the substance abuse programs and not do ACA work. And I thought that was kind of a loss because when you get into that early childhood conditioning, you really get into the origins of the defects and the challenges that we have. So that was, and so from that day forward, I fell in love with 12-step spirituality.
And how did you stumble onto Eckhart?
Well, one of the things that I inherited from my childhood was an insatiable need to know. Because I grew up in a chaotic environment, I thought that figuring things out would be my salvation.
That's a good
And
plan. That sounds like a
yeah,
very good plan, Bruce.
yeah. So yeah, so that became what Sartre would call my fundamental project to know what the hell's going on. I remember even in grammar school at 11, the teacher said, pick a short story that best, that you can relate to and kind of describes you. And I picked a story called, written by Sherwood Anderson called I Want to Know Why. And it tells the story of a young boy who lives on a farm in a very innocent environment. And then his life changes and he has to go into this city. And there he sees all the evils of mankind, a lot of cruelty and just the human dysfunction up close. And this little boy trying to make sense of it. And the short story ends with him saying, I want to know why. And that is me. So I wanted to make sense of that cruelty, the lovelessness. And I just really figured at a really young age, I have to find out why. So that became a lifelong study of psychology, spirituality, metaphysics, meditation, wanting to know why. Um, so that's been the story of my life, collecting signposts, studying systems to figure out why. Why is the human condition what it is? Why are we so cruel to each other?
Mm.
Why are we so unhappy? And so when I found the power of now, uh, it was transformative because I didn't read it. What I did is I got the audio CD of it, and he has a wonderful speaking voice, and he speaks from presence, and I find that his voice almost hypnotic. So what I did for hours and hours and hours, I would just take long, beautiful drives, listening to the power of now and a new earth over and over again. And what I found through listening to that was a transformation of my own consciousness. Things started to look more beautiful. The world didn't seem as threatening. I began to relax. And so that really was an indication that there was something really here for me. And so, I took very seriously his teachings and I tried to, he's a teacher of practices. He teaches about the human condition. He talks about what obscures us and separates us from our higher power. But he also gives very practical guidance on how to practice so that we can free ourselves from the suffering and misery and caca.
Uh, let's get into Tolle's story itself. Uh, I had hoped to get into, the introduction and chapter one of his book, but I found the introduction was so full of rich material. I think we're just going to stay there for this episode. And he says some really fascinating things. And uh, perhaps you could tell us his story, what happened to him that set the book in motion, that turned his life around. Because it sounds in many ways, although the circumstances are different, it sounds like he hit a bottom of some sort. And that opened up, it's like he fell through the hole and discovered a new world. So what was going
That
on with him?
that's right. He uh, was his family environment was a lot like mine. There was a lot of chaos. Father, explosive temper, and he was very intellectual. And he said that he really believed, kind of like me, that the intellect could solve the problems of everything. And but it wasn't working. He was working in academia, and he had bouts of suicidal depression, uh, underlying currents of fear, almost on a habitual basis. And I think in the introduction, he really tells his story in a beautiful way in terms of what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now.
Hmm.
And so, what it was like, he's in a dysfunctional environment, it depends upon thinking as a way of coping with that threatening environment. And it doesn't work. He becomes very suicidal, chronically unhappy, and the bouts of suicidal depression reach a fever pitch at the age of 29. And the urge to annihilate himself grew very intense. And that was, then he had the realization that this was really big for him. And when I first read it, I thought, I don't get it. Maybe, how could that realization be so profound? But I finally get it. Basically, he said in his depression, he says, well, wait a minute. There's me and the self that I can't live with. So he said, only maybe one of them is real, the self that I can't live with, and the person who's aware of there's a self I can't live with. And he said that realization, um, and I'll read it from the book because that thought that there's my suffering self and a me that who can be aware of the suffering self, that they're separate. And then the
Mm.
thought that only one of them is real is what catapulted him to what, Bill W. would say a spiritual experience. And I want to read this because this description, I think all of his teachings are so basically, after being suicidal, he recognizes there's me suffering, there's me who's aware of the suffering, maybe one of them is real. And they said, I was so stunned by this strange realization that my mind stopped. Very important in his teaching, the mind stopping. I was fully conscious, but there were no more thoughts. That's the essence of his teaching. Thoughtless awareness is the portal into connecting with the presence of the divine. And for someone very identified with his thinking and believing that thinking was his salvation, to finally realize that no thoughts is the avenue to something greater. But anyway, he said, then I felt drawn into what seemed like a vortex of energy. It was a slow movement at first and then accelerated. I was gripped by intense fear and my body started to shake. I heard the words resist nothing as if spoken inside my chest. This is very, very important in his teaching. He talked a lot about the emotional pain body, and he talked about the way to liberate ourselves from our suffering, our identification with suffering, is to feel intensely that energy in the body. And so here he is, before he has his great spiritual awakening, feeling the intense fear and loathing. And here's the thought, resist nothing. And this is one of his core teachings. Resist nothing in the present moment. Don't resist the feeling. Don't resist anything that's appearing in your consciousness. Don't resist it. So he heard that resist nothing. I could feel myself being sucked into a void. Very important. For Eckhart Tolle, being in the void, being in the cloud of unknowing is your access and your connection with the higher power. It's in that void where there's no thoughts. I could feel myself sucked into a void as if the void was in myself rather than outside. And I let myself fall into that void. I have no recollection of what happened next. So here, the central teaching based on his own experience is the mind stopping, feeling the intense emotion that's probably been totally repressed as fear, self-loathing, whatever, feeling it, not resisting it, the mind stopping, having an experience of the world that is stripped of conceptual interpretation or evaluation, and he falls into that no thingness, that wordless reality. And then he wakes up and he has this beautiful spiritual awakening. I was awakened by the chirping of a bird outside the window. I had never heard such a sound before. My eyes were still closed, and I saw the image of a precious diamond. Yes, if a diamond could make a sound, that is what it would be like. I recognized the room. Everything was fresh and pristine, as if it just come into existence. I picked up things, a pencil, an empty bottle, marveling at the beauty and aliveness of it all. That day, I walked around the city in utter amazement at the miracle of life on earth, as if I had just been born into the world. For the next 5 months, I lived in a state of uninterrupted peace and bliss. After that, it diminished somewhat in intensity. So the reason why I wanted to go into this a little bit more, because what I think so useful about him and why he's so effective as a teacher is because he's an experiential teacher. He speaks and teaches from experience.
Mm-hmm.
And this what it was like, suicidal, under deep unhappiness, feeling under threat, not wanting to live, having the mind stop, having these deep feelings emerge and going into them, going through them, and opening up into this thoughtless awareness was the experience or the process that put him in that transcendental realm, that connection with God.
You can't help but remember Bill Wilson's experience in Towns Hospital, and they're very, very similar. He's in a pressure cooker, and you want to get out of the pressure cooker, but the pressure cooker is having its effect, and it squeezes the ego down to a point of almost nothingness, huh? You know? And that frees this inner voice to come through. An experience of the presence of the other. Jung had a very similar, experience where he kind of went into the unconscious, and everything says, "Don't go there." Hang on to this realm of unreality that you're clinging to. And but if you drop in, and that was the exact language that Jung, he dropped in. Wilson dropped God, if there is a God. It was ego collapse. You know,
That's right.
opens you up to a new reality. And I love Richard Rohr's expression. Two things powerful enough to change a man: pain and prayer. Most people choose pain. That's how we get there. And we don't recognize that oh God, the role that it's playing in my life. You had a lot of pain growing up. I had a lot of pain growing up. And like yourself, my pain was not so much from my alcoholism. That was the attempt to cure my pain. The pain was the childhood stuff that I didn't want to look at and wasn't going to look at. There's a paragraph in the introduction that really struck me, and I'd like to read it and then have you walk us through it line by line, okay? And I'll read the whole thing, and then I'll introduce each line, and we can kind of try to break it down. So I think there's a lot of good stuff here. Tolle writes, I knew, of course, that something profoundly significant had happened to me, speaking about his experience. But I didn't understand it all. It wasn't until several years later, after I had read spiritual texts and spent time with spiritual teachers, that I realized that what everybody was looking for had already happened to me. I understood that the intense pressure of suffering that night must have forced my consciousness to withdraw from its identification with the unhappy and deeply fearful self, which is ultimately a fiction of the mind. This withdrawal must have been so complete that this false suffering self immediately collapsed, just as if a plug had been pulled out of an inflatable toy. What was left then was my true nature as the ever present I am, consciousness in its pure state prior to identification with form. And this paragraph to me is an explanation of bottom for alcoholics and addicts and anybody who really undergoes deep spiritual transformation. So that's why I think it's helpful that the ingredients are there, but they're not well understood perhaps in the beginning. So walk us through it line by line. And start with the first one. I knew, of course, that something profoundly significant had happened to me, but I didn't understand it at all. We don't realize the gift that a bottom brings, the gift that pain brings us.
Yeah, what strikes me is, but I didn't understand it all. The In his teaching, understanding, conceptual understanding is not where it's at. You can't grasp God, can't connect with God, can't connect with the great reality through the understanding faculty. So it's not surprising that he didn't understand it all.
Right.
His bottom is right there with this, the statement that uh, this unhappy and deeply fearful self. That bottom, that's the bottom. When the intensification of suffering gets so intense, you either cave under it and just try to flee from it,
Mm-hmm.
or in this case, it becomes a springboard to the liberation. And yeah, the other thing is he wasn't someone who's studying a lot of spirituality before this experience. Afterwards, it's my opinion that the spiritual teaching that most clarified his experience was the Course in Miracles. After that experience, he studied the Course in Miracles, and when he finished the transcript of Power of Now, the first person he sent it to was Marianne Williamson, who wrote a couple of really good books on the Course in Miracles. So yeah, so it was wonderful afterward that he had this understanding that all these spiritual teachings and traditions were pointing to what he had experienced. The bottom, like they said, I think it was a Richard Rohr, someone said, we're either, or no, it was Eckhart said, we can be dragged kicking and screaming into the kingdom of heaven, or
Yeah.
we can just choose to go wisely. And the other thing too is when he says that this withdrawal must have been so complete that this false suffering self immediately collapsed. This was very difficult for me to appreciate in the beginning, because I consider myself a phenomenologist, which means that we describe experience without trying to analyze it much. So I'm very loath to say something is false. If we're experiencing something, well, how could that be false? It's experience. But what he means by that as a false self is that our pain and suffering is largely created by the thoughts, evaluations, interpretations of the events of our life. And that's what's false and arbitrary. He said, and I really find this very useful to work with my suffering. He says, it's never the situation that causes us to suffer, it's our thoughts about the situation.
It takes time. You mentioned that he was drawn to the Course in Miracles. I studied that as well in I think it was the late '70s when it first came out, and it was very helpful. It was very helpful material for me to kind of get me going. I was already in recovery, but I was searching for the more, as any
Yeah.
good addict is. And the big book and such was really helpful, but it wasn't everything. I needed to go deeper than that. Wilson said it's a spiritual kindergarten, and he
Mhm.
wanted to go deeper and read a lot. So finding spiritual teachers and books. So yeah, he says it wasn't until several years later, after I had read spiritual texts and spent time with spiritual teachers, that I realized that what everybody was looking for had already happened to me. If I will really look at my own story, if I'm looking in my search for God, God is not going to be out there. God is going to be found within, and it can only be experienced by me in my way, in my life. You know, I used to say, I was going to the bars, and we would look, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of life? And then somebody said to me, well, you're never going to find the meaning of life, but you can find the meaning of your life.
Mm.
So it's like, well, this is my laboratory. My laboratory is my life. Don't be so quick to dismiss it. Don't think if I read enough books, I'm going to find it out there. It's, like you say, God is, as we understand God, is a real trap,
Yeah,
because intellectuals are going to think, well, I'm going to understand God. Well, there's an ego trip waiting to happen. You know, God is, we don't understand God, but can experience God.
absolutely.
Yeah. Here's another line. I understood that the intense pressure of suffering that night must have forced my consciousness to withdraw from its identification with the unhappy and deeply fearful self, which is ultimately a fiction of the mind. There's a letting go that happens in this bottom experience that opens me up to where the unconscious, I'm going to say, is able to break through. Jung would say the greater personality is now able to reach me. And it only comes through experience. I was really taken when Wilson said that he was sad that we had changed spiritual awakening in step 12, or changed experience to awakening. That no, experience is what he wanted to really say, because you can't doubt the experience. Once you've had it yourself, that's what you're going to draw on. You know, awakening, fluffy, fluffy. You can go on forever, uh, but experience is the real thing. And he had an experience.
When you have one of these spiritual experiences like this, where there's this the collapse of the ego,
Mhm.
and you kind of experience that transcendental reality up close, um, that's a wonderful thing. But even Eckhart says that it doesn't last. He says that that exquisiteness of that experiential reality lessened in intensity over time, although a steady background of peace accompanies him still. So I get very uneasy about people believing they're in a permanent state, that people can have a spiritual experience and be immune from the human condition,
Right,
not still undergo temptations and vacillations. I don't
right.
think that's true.
I don't either.
Ken Wilber, in a recent interview I gave last week, someone asked him that, people who are awakened or enlightened, and uh, are you, do they stay that way? And he just said, quite frankly, no. and But Eckhart is unusual. And what I really think about Eckhart, that really, I think people who really are able to maintain that connection with the divine, the higher power, the peace that comes with that, these people practice. They have the experience and then they practice. Thich Nhat Hanh, who visited LMU, and I had the privilege of actually sitting him in this little children monks at his side. And I asked him, I said, the emanation of your peace and sweetness is just so palpable. How do you do it, man? How do you do it? And he just said in that sweet little voice, he goes, it's my practice. It's my practice. It's my practice. He practices holding on to the breath. He practices not identifying with thoughts. It's practice, practice, practice. I love the way he speaks. So it's not a one and done. You don't have to continue with the right effort, and so as much as I long for a great liberating psychedelic almost experience of liberation, I know that more importantly, it's always the now. It's this moment where the obligation to free myself from the thinking is the opportunity.
And which self is operational at that moment? See, one of the beauties, I think, of two-way prayer is it puts me in contact, in conscious contact, like the step says, with the true self. And then that self is able to speak words of great peace. And then as soon as it's over, okay, ego, take over again,
Mhm.
and you need an ego to operate in the world. But if you over identify with the ego, that leads to egotism, and that leads to suffering and the problems. So this contact with this other, he says this withdrawal must have been so complete that this false suffering self immediately collapsed, just as if a plug had been pulled out of an inflatable toy. And Jung says that every encounter, I found this helpful, every encounter that the ego has with the self, the greater personality, is always experienced as a defeat by the ego. It's put in its right place, which is not down. It's not a put down. It's an embrace of my humanity rather than striving after godlike characteristics that I want,
Yeah.
Yeah, right sized, right sized.
He talks frequently about the gravitational pull of the ego.
Mm.
And because of our conditioning, that we want to be drawn, we are drawn and sucked into thinking. Now, the essence of his teaching is enlightenment or contact with higher power is simply thoughtless awareness, awareness without thought, awareness without thought. That's the opposite of the ego. So his use, I think part of his appeal too, or his genius, is that he created a lexicon all for himself. When he uses the word ego, when he uses the word unconsciousness, when he uses the word awakening, he even says in the book, don't confuse these with other teachings. So for ego, for him, is identification with your thoughts and feelings moment to moment. If you're in an ego state, there's no inner observer. There's no part of you that's watching what's going on inside you, not aware of the thoughts coming up now, not aware of the feelings coming up now, not aware of the reactions coming up now. If you don't have that witnessing presence in the moment, you're going to be in a state of ego identification and therefore separated from your higher power. So what's this mean in terms of practice?
And fear comes with that, does it not?
He says the core of an ego is a sense of always being under threat. The ego just is a part of the human experience that always feel under threat. And that's why when enlightenment and awakening occurs, so many of these people who have transcended this fear talk about seeing the world as all is well. Nothing is threatening. There's this beautiful rightness that isn't scary at all. And that is a wonderful experience. And I think that's what practicing his teachings leads to. Eckhart Tolle helps me a lot, with the 10th step about constantly taking personal inventory. That's his practice. Practicing the power of now is always keeping some attention within, asking yourself, am I at ease? Am I living in anticipation of something? Am I living in memory of something? Am I complaining about what is? It's this, and it's very much with one of my favorite teachers, Maurice Nicole, who talks about the necessity of self-observation and self-remembering to elevate ourselves to those higher centers of being. So his work is really about the living practice of keeping some attention of what's going on mentally, emotionally, in terms of reactions. Now. You observe it, and then you don't believe it, and you just realize if thoughts are appearing, they're just thoughts. I love his notes, and you observe your thoughts, you don't have to believe them. So this, in the cloud of the unknowing, when I reread it recently, I totally forgot that they talk about the cloud of forgetting.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is one of his practices. You forget this narrative that we're telling each other all the time, because it's usually a narrative that's pretty depressing or violent.
Which is one of the things that if my steady diet is in going to meetings and rehashing the pain, I don't know how helpful that is. Um, I mean, a little bit of it is good. I'm all for that. I don't want to ever forget the pain, uh, but open me up to the power of the present, you know. And that has to happen. He says, you mentioned this, that he was on a spiritual high for several months. Says he was reborn. Same words that Wilson chose in the big book. Same words that John chose in his gospel. This is a new level of consciousness. That we're all searching for, and it's closer to us than we think.
But again, the key is conscious contact is always available now. And the way we do it is by dropping thinking. You have to drop thinking. Enlightenment is thoughtless awareness. And for me, whose whole salvation was trying to think my way out of pain, that was
Right.
quite a jolting realization. But as I practice, I see that's true. I've had two very painful traumas in my life in the last couple of weeks. And what I do, I practice the power of now. I go, okay, here's these thoughts about these situations. I don't identify with them. I just allow them to be. I feel the you know the impact of that on my body, and focus my attention what's happening now without thought, and that that is uh, uh, that is contact with the higher power, the freedom and liberation from thought. Because there's a link. I've studied a lot of neuroscience, and there's a real link between thought and emotion, and that's why his teaching so emphasizes uh, transcending thought, or just looking at thought as thought and not being identified with it. And so when we tell stories in the meetings, it's helpful to know what it was like, what happened, and how you changed. That's really good. But he
Yeah.
really warns against having a conceptual sense of identity. So again, there's a real hostility in his teaching against wordless, wordful, conceptual reality and identifying with it. Why? Because when we're thinking, we're not feeling the embrace of what he calls the radiant joy of being. When thinking is is I believe thinking, if it's you're thinking, with the four absolutes, that's good thinking. Unselfish, loving, pure. That type of those thoughts are beneficial, I believe. But the majority,
It's the right use of the ego mind.
yeah, because it's
Yeah.
delighting in good and truth and connecting us with everyone. Um, but I love his line early on in the book. He says, "In our age, thinking has become a dreadful affliction.
Yes.
Thinking has become a dreadful affliction, and we have to slow down, feel the breath, get still inside, and guess what? A liberation does come. You're no longer in that ick of the unhappy thoughts about the misery about self and others and all the drama. So it's quite it's kind of a real simple teaching, but it's really difficult to do because there's a lot of resistance to stopping and just acknowledging what you're feeling, watching it. He says, I think this is a really good observation. He says most people who can't do these practices, you don't want to stop and observe yourself, because the first thing you're going to find when you observe yourself is the pain that you're feeling in some extent. So there's the gravitational pull to flee from the suffering that we're experiencing in the present moment is the greatest obstacle to living in conscious contact with God. And the other thing he says, which is really true, is God or a higher power or the experience of the divine cannot be grasped with the mind. It has to be felt. It has a felt connection with the interconnectedness of things. So we can't, unfortunately, I'm sad to say, my life mission to understand it through thinking was didn't work and couldn't work because it's only, the other thing he teaches too, this is very important, is stillness is being still, having very few thoughts, hardly no thoughts, no emotions, in that stillness and silence, like all the mystical writers say. In
Right.
stillness, in silence, there is a felt realization of, wow, I'm pretty cool.
It brings you into the presence, capital P, of that other, capital O.
Yeah,
And that's the place of peace.
yeah.
You know, when I started studying Jung, I think it was in Edward Edinger, where he pointed out the story of the of Adam and Eve in the garden, where they're hiding under the bushes when God comes around, because they are aware of their, not just their nakedness. I mean, they were naked before, but they became conscious of it. And conscious of what? Of separation from God. That's what they
Mm.
became conscious of. And so they're hiding out of guilt.
Mhm.
And that, I think, is the dynamic that you were speaking of earlier, Bruce, of how the ego operates, that it's fear-based because it has taken on divine proportions. This is the inflation,
Yeah,
the puffed upness. And if you find out that I'm false, whoo,
yeah.
I'm in real trouble.
Especially in this period of intense suffering for me, noticing and dropping, okay, there's pain present in my life, and then naturally all these thoughts about it, trying to understand it, memories, this comes in, and
Right.
it's mental stuff. And if I just drop it, observe it, okay, these thoughts are brought, and just get back to the practice of the power now, to stay rooted in the now, you have to be, they're very simple, common mindfulness practices. Breath awareness through, he's really big on feeling the inner body, feeling the inner sensation, all experiences without thought. You can become aware of your breath without thought. You can just listen to the sounds without thought. Now that's a
Yeah.
means to an end, but it's a necessary means. And the means is, when you do that, when you go into thoughtless awareness, what appears is the simplicity of the moment, the suchness as is, And guess what? A lot of that suffering that was mind created and reactive to pain lessened.
That's
And so
right.
I've been astonished at I think years ago, if I would experience the traumas I have in the last couple of weeks, I would just be thrashing around, just totally jerked around by the pain of my conditioning, and be unable to function. So I know these practices work. It's especially helpful for couples, because Eckhart writes a lot about relationship as being your primary practice that's going to lead you to enlightenment, because he says deeply conditioned patterns of the ego, especially the shadowy stuff, come out in relationships. So to practice that present, practice the power of now, free yourself from your thinking and emotional reactions when you're in relationship, especially an intimate relationship, is absolutely necessary. And I'm really happy to see how a lot of my couples I work with have really benefited through these practices. And it's a beautiful thing. We get caught up into these emotional reactions in relationships, and then you're just all ego, all shadow.
Right.
It's
Yeah. I'm glad
hell.
you focused as much as you have on the need for practice. That this is not a one-shot deal. This is a lifelong adventure. Uh, I mean, I'm 50 years sober. So what? I can
Yep.
be as crazy as anybody if I think as
Mhm.
a solution, as a solution. Uh, what was his name? Tom Powers in Invitation to the Great Experiment. He was a student of Wilson's. Wilson was his sponsor, and he's got a line in his book how when a new person comes into the meeting and he's just been kicked in the gut by life and he's just in the corner crying, and there's nothing left of him. He said we should all gather around him because he can be a source of great wisdom. uh, whereas if we try to bring our ego minds to it, we're already contaminated it. So he's big too, as you would say, on watchfulness, on mindfulness, the step 10 business. If I don't watch, I won't know what the hell to pray for, you know? And the other thing I was just would comment on is so many of the people, when I listen to their two-way prayers in their writing, the voice will say to them, breathe,
Mm.
breathe. It's a reminder, put this thinking stuff down and be present. Be present.
I was really blown away by the last guest who was sharing her two-way prayer journal. And she said that, I don't know what you want to call it, her loving parent or whatever, told her, uh, breathe when you get upset, when you can breathe, because that is when you do that, you're connected to the umbilical cord that connects you to the divine matrix. That was just so beautiful. And that's what these practices are. Um, it's always now. There's always, taking responsibility for your life is always taking your responsibility for what is going on inside you now, and also acceptance. We'll get to it at a later episode, but he has a lot of teachings about finding this kingdom of peace through acceptance, conscious acceptance. Like when before he had his spiritual experience, he heard those words, resist nothing.
Right.
And so these are some very simple, powerful practices, and the intellect can just, for a while I trivialized them. You're just watching the breath, you're feeling the inner body, you're
Right, right,
noticing
right.
your emotions. There's nothing, so what? But when you actually do these things, you feel the liberation from, our minds are dangerous things. What we think and how we interpret and evaluate ourselves and others is just creates a lot of unnecessary suffering.
Well, listen, Bruce, we could go on and on. This has been really, really helpful, and I think a nice introduction to the work. So I thank you for sharing your experience and your wisdom with us. And then in the upcoming series, we'll kind of go through the book. Encourage you to get a copy of the book. I'm going to put it in the show notes. You can order it. From Amazon, or lots of used copies out there. And there's also PDF copies, so it can be free. I'll put those also in the show notes. And I will put a link to Dr. Bruce if you'd like to send him a message. He would love to hear from you. So, Dr. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to the series, and want to thank you guys for listening. And I hope it is going to open some doors for you. I know when I first went into AA meetings, I was wise enough to look at on the wall, and where I saw that sign that said "Think, Think, Think," I said, "No, that one's not for me." Okay. Well, again, thank you guys. Hope this was helpful, and I hope you'll keep coming back. And if it was helpful, turn on some of your friends to some of these podcasts. Don't keep it to yourself. So God bless, and keep coming back.